Hello everybody and welcome back to another exciting edition of Boyographic, show in which I, Matt, the Gameboy, will take you through the highs and lows of the Gameboy library, one cart at a time. This week, we're going back to September with R-Type 2. With the first R-Type shipped, a game that everyone said couldn't be done on the little handheld that could, it was only natural that Bits wanted to explore more of iRem's back catalogue, and what better place to start than with the game's sequel, R-Type 2. Jace Austin put together a demo of the game's third stage before moving on to another project. While unfortunately that demo's been lost to time, it did impress iRem, and soon they were asking Bits to produce a sequel. Unfortunately though, by that time, Austin was too busy with other projects, leaving Bits in need of another programmer with a proven track record to get the ambitious port off the ground. Enter Bob Pape. Pape was no stranger to porting iRem's classic arcade games to other systems, programming ports of both R-Type and Dragon Breed for the ZX Spectrum. Having just got back from the US after working on a Master System version of PGA Tour Golf, Pape's agent reached out to him with an opportunity to work for Bits on the game, which he quickly accepted after hearing the man handling the graphics would be Mark Jones, his collaborator on the ZX Spectrum port of the original game. In Pape's own words, he saw the game as an easy way to get into Game Boy development with a project he already knew he could achieve. On the original game's port to the Spectrum, Pape had spent a lot of time thinking, how do I do this and then how do I code it? With a Game Boy port, he could simply skip that first step entirely and focus on getting the game right. Surprisingly, Pape wasn't given Austin's original code for the first game, nor could he use any of the work he'd originally done for the Spectrum, because the Game Boy's custom version of the Sharp 8 processor missed a lot of the registers present in the home computer. Unintimidated though, Pape rolled up his sleeves and dived into the task at hand. The first thing that might surprise you about the sequel is a dip in the frame rate. While the original game ran at 60 in most places, the sequel runs instead at a steady 30, which provides a little bit of a jitter, but I would argue probably wouldn't be that noticeable if you weren't playing the game back to back, as I did. And to its credit, it does keep that 30 rather consistently with very minimal slowdown and tearing. If you were a sane person playing this game, however, the first thing you'd notice was the difficulty spike. With its roots in the arcade and thus a philosophy of sucking money out of the pockets of punters, R-Type is a hard game. Its sequel was bold enough to ask the question, what if we notch the difficulty up already from the second level and earn even more money? And thus, the Game Boy port 2 is a definite challenge. After getting quite good at R-Type to beat it, I'd expected the challenge to be upped in the sequel, but I wasn't expecting to die right out of the gate. The experience of playing R-Type 2 for the first time really makes it hard to get into flow while playing the game. The game really does require some memorization of patterns and layout in order to progress, and a ship just coming in from off-frame, killing you dead and sending you back to a checkpoint really isn't the best way to do that. That said, the port is fairly accurate to the arcade version, meaning that if you have any experience with that, you'll know roughly where to park your ship for safety in any given run, even on a smaller screen. To compensate for this difficulty spike, the game does grant you more lives and unlimited continues. There is also an option to press down and select at the title screen to raise and lower the difficulty, but this only affects how many hits the bosses take, not the amount of enemies or their patterns. The bosses themselves all look great, even in the Game Boy's limited screen size. The likes of Zabtum still feel as threatening as in the arcade version, but much like the first Game Boy game, the bosses do eat a large chunk of screen real estate, severely limiting the encounters. Pape especially wasn't happy with how stripped down the third level boss became because of this, and tried to change it, but was asked by iRem to keep it as is. Of course, it's not only the bosses that end up a little limited by the hardware. Several changes are made to the level design and enemies, as well as completely dropping the game's fourth level. In hindsight, this is something Pape would have liked to have tried to fit in, but it was decided from the off that this level might be a bit too ambitious for the Game Boy by iRem and Bits. The 16 bits of memory that could have been used for the level were instead used to flesh out the experience a little. An animated introduction, a more ambitious title card, and an iRem logo found themselves occupying it, and that's just how it goes sometimes. Not that they all don't look impressive, of course. Mark Jones's graphic work is as great as on the first title, and small updates to things like the info bar at the bottom of the screen and fleshing out the beam laser look great. Jones's work acts as a red thread between the sequel and the original game in a way that I think can't be understated. Yes, they're both ports and thus might not have been too dissimilar if another artist had worked alongside Pape, but I do think Jones's involvement between the first and second game is really important. His understanding of the hardware must have at some point had an influence on Pape's programming and in turn got it closer to Austin's original even if they didn't share a line of code. Dave Whittaker's 8-bit interpretations of the game's music isn't to be forgotten either, and I think maybe I actually prefer it overall to the first game, though I do think that's probably down to me preferring Ashida Masahiko's score for R-Type 2 to Masato Izakashi's score for the original, but I'm probably in the minority there. Overall, R-Type 2 for the Game Boy is a solid port that I think, given even iRem themselves struggled to port the game to the Super Nintendo in Super R-Type, people need to cut a little bit of slack to. There are only a few reviews of the game out there, owing, I'd imagine, to the fact the game never saw a release in the United States outside of R-Type DX, but those I did encounter seemed overly negative to what I assure you is a tough but well-crafted game. Sure, I did struggle beating it. There were some swear words thrown at the screen and a lot of patience required to learn the stages, but that's honestly par for the course when it comes to a shmup. When I did finally get there though, I couldn't believe my eyes. After a lengthy story crawl, I saw credits and the words "programmed in Wales." I'd later learn that it was made less than an hour away from where I grew up, and just a stone's throw away from where I'd eventually buy the game as a teenager. While I can't promise you two will find a little smile caused by serendipity at the end of R-Type 2, I can promise that if you like the first game, well, you're gonna like this one too. And that brings us to the end of another Boyographic, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed. A huge thank you to both Jace Austin and Bob Pape for helping me out with this review. And a bit of an apology that this ended up being 6 months later than I'd intended it, but hey, baby steps, folks. We're growing the channel again. Until next week, though, Game Boys and Girls, where I'll be back with a Japanese review. Be sure to game on.